On the eve of this tragedy that was about to occur, I would say that she had a ton of friends, she had no enemies, and she was perfectly satisfied with her position in life. And nobody could have anticipated what was about to happen to her. The day started just like all the days for her. She drove across town of a morning and went to class all day. She was expecting a very difficult exam the next day and spent all of her spare time on the campus studying for that exam. And then she came back home and she had dinner with her parents. And over dinner, she told them she had to go back to the campus to get ready for that exam tomorrow. And said, I'll be back home at 11 o'clock. She found 3 girls in the dorm, and they went to a study hall in the dorm. She didn't leave until midnight. She did have some contact with a male student friend of hers after she got in her car. She got in her car that was parked in one of those driveways on the campus across Broadway from Forer Hall. And he drove up beside of her and they chatted for just a few minutes and then kind of left in their cars bumper to bumper. He only drove about maybe a block and a half and went into a parking lot beside of a men's dorm where he lived. And so he then went into that dorm, but he saw her car going south on Upper Street, and that would have taken her home in about 15 minutes. At 11 o'clock, her mother got concerned about her. Then she got really upset around midnight, and so she came to the campus looking for her car. And she did that twice. Went all around the campus. She went to that dorm. The dorm was locked and dark. She did that until 2:30 in the morning. At 2:30, she got Betty Gail's father out of bed, and they called the police. And the police put out the all points bulletin announcing that there was a missing student, given the car and the description of the girl and the driver's license on the car. And all of the police who were on duty started looking for the car. A police officer who was patrolling over near the campus, he saw a car fitting this description. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. He saw it sitting up that main driveway there in front of Morrison Hall, and he could see from the road, from the street where he was, looked like there was one person in it, a driver. And so he went up there, and he was the first person to discover her in the car. And what he saw was a teenage-looking girl. She was sitting in the car under the steering wheel with her feet on the floorboard. Her head was back over the back of the front seat. She had a brassiere around her neck, and she was obviously dead.
Professor Lawson, it's good to see you again.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I haven't seen you since the Kentucky Humanities Kentucky Book Fair a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
For you and for the University Press of Kentucky. This story started a long time ago. So tell me about what you began to learn. First, what you learned in 1961. You were still in law school. But what you remember about Betty Gail Brown, how she was portrayed, and then what you learned about her when you started working on the case.
I had just come to University of Kentucky to go to law school. And of course, you know what the newspapers were like in those days. They went crazy over it. And so I got intensely interested in it when I was a student, as did almost every law student that was in the law school at that time. She was a college student. She was in her second year of college over at Transylvania. She had spent all of her life here in Lexington, although a very short one because of this tragedy.
She was how old when she was killed?
She was 19 and a half. When she was killed, she was in the beginning of her second year of college. Now, she had gone to public schools here in Lexington. She was the only child of 2 parents that she had an unbelievably close relationship to, particularly her mother. She had a very close relationship with her mother. They lived on the other side of town from Transylvania. She was very active in campus activities. She drove across town every day from home and back home that night, and she had lots and lots of friends on the campus, male and female, and every one of them described her as a very likable, nice, friendly person. And as far as I could ever tell in looking at it, she didn't have an enemy.
She was studying with some friends in was it in a dormitory?
Yes.
And is that dormitory still in existence?
Still there, Forer Hall.
Oh.
It's right on Broadway now, right straight across from the center of the campus at Transy. Now she left home about 7 and got to that dorm about 7:15. That's about how long it took her to get across town. She had planned to leave the dorm at about 11, but she found the house mother sometime before that and got permission to stay longer, and so she didn't leave until midnight. And she left. The house mother let her out of the dormitory.
Where did the male friend see her? In the parking lot?
They were in a driveway that was across from Forer Hall, and this student saw her heading down a street. It was upper, heading toward home, and he saw her at 12 o'clock, and she had been home in 15 minutes. She didn't get there. They never saw her after. This was the last person to see her alive.
All right, this will be my first directed question to you on your opinion. What's your speculation on, from the time the male friend saw her leave that area where they were in conversation and drive down upper, he went to his dorm, and then she was found in the circular drive in front of the auditorium, in front of the hall. What happened?
Well, I think before I answer that question, I ought to tell you the second piece of this story, and that is the Alex Arnold confession. They investigated this case like crazy for all the way until the end of 1961. They had 25 police officers working around the clock on it. The best detectives in the police department, and all the help they could possibly need. At the end of that year, they were in total darkness as to two things. They had no idea as to motive. There was never any motive. Now, they started out because of what they found at the scene, that the murder might have been a part of a sexual event. She was strangled with her own bra. When they got in the car, they saw that the top two buttons on her blouse were unbuttoned. She didn't have a bra on, so they concluded early on, okay, she was strangled with her own bra, and it was part of a sexual event. But almost instantly after that, that thought withered away, because they found that all of the rest of her clothing were undisturbed, as got reported in the paper the next day, neat and in perfect array. Now, the autopsy convinced the police that she had not been involved in sexual activity, because she was in her menstrual period.
Okay.
And she had a tampon. You know, in the investigation, the police, the investigators, got a diary that she had kept. And they didn't get the diary. I mean, the mother gave them the names of all of the people she had dated while she was on the Transy campus. And there was a pretty significant number of those, and the police interrogated all of them, and they gave polygraph examinations to several of them, and they ended up with nothing out of that. And so they chased down every single lead that they could find, every rumor, every tip, going all the way through that year. So the 12 weeks of around the clock, very aggressive investigation, and ended up in darkness. I mean, they had no idea as to who it might have been or why it had occurred. Now, they continued the investigation pretty aggressively through 1962. They did all kinds of things. You know, they went to Michigan to interview a student who'd quit school the day after Betty died. They went to Atlanta, Georgia to interview an employee who had abruptly left. They went to New York and interviewed a graduate of the college who was up there wearing women's clothing, and he had a year after the killing, he was found in possession of a big, thick stack of newspaper articles about it, and that caused them to get suspicious of him. They chased all kinds of things like that down all through 1962. And then it sort of, they lost their, not interest, but they just didn't have much hope after that.
No leads.
The leads are all gone, the rumors were withering away, and so it became a cold case, I would say, at the beginning of 63 and 64. And then, at the beginning of 1965, the other character in this story, Alex Arnold Jr., stepped into the picture and took an action that revived the whole thing and probably made it hotter than it had ever been because of the nature of what he said. But
you had joined a law firm in Lexington at that time?
I had. I'd been in the firm for about 2 years when this case was tried, and I'd done a lot of work with the lawyer who was first appointed to defend him. His name was Amos Eblin, and in 1965, I would say he was probably the most highly respected lawyer in the state of Kentucky, and they wanted somebody like that in this case because of the publicity that the case had and was going to get. And so when he was asked to do this, he came and asked me if I would help him and got me appointed as co-counsel, so the two of us. But he was the one that they selected originally because he had the reputation for it, and I was a beginner. This occurred all the way across the country in a little town called Klamath Falls, Oregon. Alex Arnold Jr. had all kinds of roots in Kentucky, more Lexington than any place else, but not just that. I would call him an occupant rather than a resident of Klamath Falls because he had made his way out there in a very unusual way. He had no money, he had no car, he had no job. He's sleeping on the streets. On this day in January of 1965, he started drinking. When he got up, he got in trouble that day with the police and got arrested for disorderly conduct and public intoxication. And he was taken promptly to a police court judge, and the police court judge found him guilty of public intoxication and fined him $25 for that intoxication. Well, he didn't have a nickel on him, and so they sent him to jail for 10 days to pay off the fine and the court costs. And he was fined in the jail for a couple of days. And then that all occurred on a Saturday. On Monday, he started seeing things on the wall, creatures crawling on the wall of his cell. He started talking to the toilet paper in his cell. He was trying to deal with a mind-reading machine that was there. He was having delirium tremens. He'd been off alcohol for a couple of days. And so he then threatened to kill himself while he was in the jail. And so they set him off where they could watch him around the clock. And a day after that all started, he said to a jail employee, "I need to talk with somebody." And the jail employee said, "Okay, we'll talk." And he said, "No, I need to talk with a police officer. I've got to get something off my chest." And so he goes and gets a detective in the Klamath Falls Police Department to come to the jail, and he comes over there and he puts Alex Arnold and this detective together. And Arnold says, "Get me out of this cell away from this mind-reading machine." So he takes him to another part of the jail, and the detective said to him, "Well, I understand you need to talk with somebody." He said, "Yes, I've got to get something off my chest." The detective said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "I think I killed a woman back in Kentucky." And the detective said to him, "Well, when did you do that, and who did you kill?" Said, well, I don't know. It was 3 or 4 years ago. And it was Betty Gail Brown, who was a student. And the detective said to him, are you sure you killed her? And he said, I'm 99% sure I killed her. Well, from then on, the detective then, he had him examined by a physician, and that physician later became a witness for the prosecution in the case. This was a physician from the county health department there in Oregon, and he told the detective there's nothing wrong with him. I mean, he's sound mentally, he's sound physically, and so that's when the detective in Klamath Falls called Lexington and got the police from the Lexington Police Department involved in it, and within one day, they were in Klamath Falls, Oregon, and pulled Arnold out of the jail and started the interrogation of him that ended up producing the confession, which was the key to the trial. This was a handwritten confession written by the police officer, the detective who went out there, and given to Arnold after they interrogated him under the best circumstances. They provided every protection to which he was entitled, and they got this written confession from him that he signed under oath. Now, in this confession, he basically said that he'd been drunk all day. He was drunk at night, been drinking all day, drunk at midnight, and needed to go someplace to sleep it off. Said, I went up he was hanging around a place called Black Cup Restaurant Grill, which was down on Main and Broadway, right on that corner there, which was about 3 blocks from Transylvania. He said, I wanted to sleep it off at midnight, so I walked away from there and went up to Gratz Park. Now, when I got to Gratz Park, there were people there. I was going to sleep in Gratz Park, but there were people there, so I decided to walk across the street and go over to the campus. And I went over to the campus, and I found a place where I could sleep under some bushes, and I laid down and I went to sleep. I woke up from the cold at some point. Now, he said he had a half a bottle of wine, drank all of his wine, and then decided to go back where he'd been, which would have been back down on Broadway and Main. And as he was walking across the campus toward Main Street, he saw this car sitting in front of Morrison Hall in that driveway. And this is the thing that inflamed this case again. He said as he walked by, there were 2 girls in the car making love with each other, kissing and hugging each other. And he said, as I walked by, I asked them for a match. I wanted to smoke, I had cigarettes, but I had no matches. They started screaming at me. I walked on and they kept screaming at me, and I got mad. I went back, opened the door, grabbed the girl on the driver's side and slammed her head against the dashboard and knocked her out. And the other girl got out of the car and ran away. And I was scared I'd get caught, so I got in the car. There was a brassiere hanging over the back of the front seat, and I put it around her neck and I choked her to death. Then I went on, I locked the car doors and I went on down the street. In the trial of the case, when we were defending him, the prosecution pretty much ignored that part of the confession. And we introduced lots of evidence to show that she had never shown any interest in girls. And the last 2 witnesses of the trial was the mother and father of Betty Gail Brown. We put them on the witness stand to testify only to that they, she had never shown interest. She had boyfriends, both high school and college. And so I could never buy that part of his story.
Yeah.
I guess I always thought it had to be somebody connected to the college. Now, I don't know whether employee, whether student, or what, because she clearly left the campus in a car at 12 o'clock in the morning, and then they find her in the car at 3 o'clock. What is the likelihood, if it was a total stranger or somebody not connected to the college, that the car would have been brought back to the campus? And so I always had difficulty, figuring that out. Now, in terms of trying to defend our client, we didn't have to worry too much about that. We're basically saying he's given a confession here that is not reliable. And of course, we connected that up with a very serious alcohol problem that he had had for a period of 10 years by the time he got to Oregon and gave that confession.
How long did the trial last?
It lasted, I believe, 7 days, but now I'm guessing it might have been 6 days, but it was a pretty extensive trial. It was a trial about virtually nothing except the confession. When I first wrote this book, I gave some thought to naming it The Trial of a Confession. Now, the University Press didn't like that. They wanted Betty Gail Brown's name on it, so that's what it became. But it was a 7-day trial, and the whole thing focused totally on his confession and whether or not you could rely on his confession. From the time he came into this picture and gave the confession, he did not speak with certainty. He told the first detective that he talked to out there, "I'm 99% sure I killed her." Now, he stuck to that position, though, through most of our year while he was in jail, until right toward the end of it, he began to change and have doubts in his own mind about it. Now, the significance of that was that they had no evidence on they were able to prove that he was in Lexington on the night of the killing. He was hanging around down there around that bar. But they had no other evidence to connect him to this murder other than his confession. And so at the trial of the case, we put him on the witness stand. And what he testified to on the witness stand was, "I don't believe I killed her, but I'm not absolutely sure of that." Now, that was his testimony in the trial of the case. The last conversation that I had with him, and it was while the jury was out. The jury was deliberating, and they deliberated all day. And they kept him in a little jail cell in the courthouse. And after 3 or 4 hours, I went over there just to see him and talk to him, see how he's doing and all that. And he, in the course of that, he asked me, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. It's a close case. It could go either way." And he said, "That's not what I mean. Do you think I killed her?" And I said, "Well, I don't know whether you did, and you seem not to know." And so in the end, the jury ended up hung. You had 7 of them voting to acquit him. You had 5 voting for conviction, and they never retried him after that. I'd say it was about halfway between the time he was brought back here and put in jail and the time of the trial. I was visiting with him in the jail, and he told me that Betty Gail Brown's mother has just visited me with the jail, and she told me I didn't kill their daughter. Now, I got real mad over that the jailers had let her in there to talk with him.
It seems a bit strange.
Well, I confronted them with it over it. I was real angry over that because it shouldn't have happened. Well, they couldn't find any evidence that it had happened. And then sometime after that, a lawyer about my age, he was in school with me, called me and said he wanted to come talk to me about the case. And he was representing the Browns, the mother and the father. They just wanted somebody to help them through all this. And he told me they don't believe Arnold killed her, and they want you all to know that. Now, after the trial was over and after the hung jury, they made a public statement to the press through this lawyer in which they basically told them that they were really pleased with the way the case was handled by both the prosecution and the defense. And they then made a statement, "We're going to continue to look for and try to figure out who murdered our daughter. So they didn't believe he did it. Now, I guess I have to think that the main motivating force there was his statement about her being there making love with another girl. Now, as I said to you earlier, homosexuality in 1961 was viewed differently than it is today. And so, you know, maybe that had more to do with it than anything else, but they very clearly did not think he was the one. Well, there was a very harmful, hurtful rumor that the mother had done it, and that lingered. It started on the campus over there, mm-hmm. and it lingered for months and months. And I don't know, I found lots of information in the police records about that rumor. And the police dismissed every bit of her from day one, because, I mean, they would, if somebody came in with something, mm-hmm. and they had both students and non-students coming in, and there was never any basis for any of it. And so they finally got tired of it. The mother was hurt badly by it. I have a segment in there where I describe a visit that she made with one of her close friends.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
lived out there on the
mm-hmm.
on the same street, and Chief Hale was the chief of police mm-hmm. then, and so the mother came into the police to talk to him about it and about the rumor and all, and they took her to Frankfurt, her and her husband to Frankfurt, to the best polygraph operator in the state. And he gave them polygraph examinations. Mm-hmm. They passed it with flying mm-hmm. colors. Mm-hmm. And Chief Hale released all that, even the questions that was asked to her, mm-hmm. got put in the press. And he basically said, this is a totally unfounded, hurtful mm-hmm. rumor, and it needs to stop.
Yeah.
And it pretty much stopped after
yeah.
that. But there was one piece of the investigation that attracted more attention in 1961 than anything else. And it started with a waitress from a restaurant in the vicinity of Transylvania over there, mm-hmm. where Transylvania students regularly went. About 2 days after the killing, she walks into the police station and she tells the police that she was a waitress at this restaurant. Now, Betty Gail's picture had been on the front page of the newspaper mm-hmm. the day before. Mm-hmm. Her normal picture, and then they had a picture of her
yeah.
in the car with her bra mm-hmm. around her neck.
Yeah.
And this waitress came to the police station. She says, I think I saw her in my restaurant at 1:30 in the morning, and she was with another girl. Mm-hmm. Now, that got blown up in the newspapers mm-hmm. from the minute she showed up. I don't know who leaked it, but it got out mm-hmm. quickly, and it became a headline that they're looking for this other girl.
Yeah.
Now, what the police did was they took this waitress to the morgue and let her see the body, and she said, that's her. That's who I saw. Mm-hmm. Let her see her clothing. Said, yeah, that's what she was wearing. Mm-hmm. And so they then took her undercover to the funeral. And this funeral drew hundreds and hundreds of people. Flooded out onto the street from the church. Church mm-hmm. wouldn't hold them where they had this funeral. Mm-hmm. Now, these were largely students, high school and Transy students. And took her undercover, let her stay there, look at all those people. She couldn't identify the other girl. They then took her to the burial site. She still couldn't identify anybody. They took her over to this dormitory where Betty Gail had studied that night and let her see all of the females who lived in that mm-hmm. dormitory. She mm-hmm. still couldn't identify anybody. Then they took her and they showed her all of the pictures of every female student on the Transy campus. She couldn't identify anybody. Now, all of this, though, got blown up in a newspaper explained in great detail with one big headline saying, the police are ready to arrest another girl. Okay, now all of that was in the newspaper, and all of that was known to everybody. Now, I always thought that it's from that maybe where he gets this piece of his story, in which he says she was there with another girl making love.
Professor Lawson, if Arnold didn't kill Betty Gail Brown, who did?
There are no answers to any of that because of the gaps in the evidence and because they could never establish a motive for the killing of her. And without that motive, there's almost no way to determine. Now, the one possibility is, and it would have to be a very old person now, you know. I mean, we're now 56 or 57 years from the killing. Somebody may step forward one of these days and say, I did it. I don't know, but unless that happens, it's going to be an unsolved murder, I think.
It's a fascinating story.
Well, I've found it fascinating myself, the most fascinating thing I ever did in my professional life.
Well, thank you for talking with us again.
Okay, glad to do it.
Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Miriam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. The Betty Gail Brown episode will be a two-part series. This episode discusses an unsolved murder involving some disturbing details and may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our podcast. I'm Miriam, and today we are chatting with Wayne Johnson. Wayne Johnson is a librarian with the Lexington Public Library. He's been working at LPL for 27 years. He grew up in Lexington and is our resident local history buff. The tragic murder of Betty Gail Brown in 1961. Thank you, Wayne, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I wanted to go over what our town was like. What was Lexington like in the early 1960s?
Okay. Well, I grew up here in Lexington in the 60s. In the fall of 1961, Lexington still had the splendor and charm of a small town, college town. We had UK, Transy. The population of Lexington was around 63,000.
Okay.
And Fayette County as a whole had a population of about 133,000. We were still more than a decade away from the merger of city and county governments. To show you how much we grew in the 60s, by the end of the 60s, population of Lexington was 108,000.
Wow.
And the county as a whole was 174,000 at the end of the decade of the 60s. This was about a 32% gain of population during a decade, made Lexington one of the fastest growing communities in the United States.
So it was a pivotal time during the 1960s.
Yes, for sure. Also in 1961, the transformation of Lexington from an economy based on retail, tobacco, horse farms, etc., had already just begun. The local industrial revolution could be said to have begun in 1956 when IBM came into town, and then Square D came in 1958, and other industries following shortly afterwards. But in 1961, compared to today, we were still a very small city, college town, you could say. Like the rest of the country in the early 60s, Lexington experienced the civil rights movement, although not as on a grand scale as some of the other cities down south. Sit-downs had begun in the early 60s in restaurants and theaters in downtown Lexington. This was a Lexington I grew up in the early 60s. Back in those days, the public library was actually located in Gratz Park, across the street from Transylvania's campus in Old Morrison. It was always a treat as a kid to visit the Carnegie Library. and play in Gratz Park, including the James Lane Allen fountain outside. I still remember going to the public library was a treat, but actually driving by Old Morrison was even just as
It's a grand
great
building,
treat.
yeah. it's a
Oh,
great-
for sure. So we were always fascinated about Old Morrison and seeing the building every time we visited. Very impressive building. And I do have a memory as a youngster when we were out playing in Gratz Park that sometimes we point across the street to Old Morrison, and I have vague memories of talking about, well, something bad happened over there. But I didn't, I was 4 or 5 years old. I didn't
Yeah.
quite know
What
what
the
happened.
story
But I
was.
just knew growing up that something very terrible had happened over there in front of Old Morrison.
And of course, that event was the murder of Betty Gail Brown. So Betty Gail Brown, what was her early life like as a child?
Well, Betty Gail was born on May 4th, 1942 in Richmond, Kentucky, to Hargis and Quincy Brown. She was their only child, and she was a war baby. May 1942, the World War II had just begun. Our involvement in the war drew many Americans away from their families, including Betty Gail's father. In fact, Betty Gail did not see her father until after the war ended in 1945. When the Lexington Leader newspaper sponsored what was called my Big Moment Essay Contest for children in early 1951, 8-year-old Betty Gail referred to the separation from her father with her essay entry. And let me just read you what appeared in the newspaper. This is February 23rd, 1951. And the headline was, Betty Gail Brown's big moment was seeing her daddy home from war for the first time. The article goes on and says, a letter addressed to my big moment. Editor arrived today from Betty Gail Brown, age 8, 133 Iroquois Court. She wrote, my big moment was when my daddy came home from the war and I saw him for the first time. I was only 3 years and 2 months old when he came. I went right into his arms and was not afraid of him either. He had been gone overseas 3.5 years, and I was sure it was he because I had seen so many pictures of him. I already loved him because he had sent me dolls from Iceland, Ireland, England, and France. So Betty Gail entered this contest, and there was hundreds of entries. And out of all the entries, she won second prize with her essay and won a puppy as a prize.
That's a nice prize.
Oh, yeah, great prize. A few months later, on Sunday morning, July 15th, 1951, Betty Gail Brown made her first appearance on the front page of the newspaper with this headline, unfortunately, tragic moment for Big Moment Prize winner. 9-year-old Betty Gail Brown center wept bitterly yesterday afternoon when a hit-and-run motorist killed her 6-month-old puppy, the prize she won in the Herald Leader My Big Moment contest. Unfortunately, this would not be the last sad headline for Betty Gail.
Yeah.
Now, growing up in Lexington, Betty Gail was your typical youngster who was very active in church and school activities. Her mother got her involved with her church early on. She began attending her church choir practice when she was 1 year old. Was pretty young.
Yeah.
And she continued to sing in the choir until her death in 1961. She began attending Sunday school at the age of 2, and as she got older, she taught Sunday school at her church. She actually taught a class the Sunday before her death.
Wow.
As a student at Lafayette High School, she was a member of the National Honor Society and won a 4-year scholarship to Transylvania. And in January 1960, in her senior year, she won a prestigious award as reported by the newspaper. Betty Gail appeared in the newspaper quite a bit.
Quite often, it
Back
seems
in back in those days, the newspapers did more reporting on social events and kids'
Yeah.
activities,
Yeah.
much more so than they do today. So it was always a thrill for somebody to appear in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, when she won this award, it was reported in the newspaper, and it went as follows. DAR award goes to Betty Brown. Miss Betty Gail Brown, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Hargis T. Brown, has been selected by the faculty and student body of Lafayette Senior High School to receive the annual Good Citizens Award presented annually by the Bryan Station Chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, to an outstanding senior girl. And there's a good definition of Betty Gail in the rest of this article, and let me read that. Miss Brown has been selected on the basis of dependability, service, leadership, and patriotism to her school. She is a member of the National Honor Society, Beta Club, French Club, Pep Club, Charmettes, Student Service Corps, College Club Girls Choir, representative for Lafayette and Christmas Caravan, and secretary of Inter-Club Council of Y-Teens. She is a member of Central Christian Church and is at present treasurer of the church youth group and a choir member. She's a very busy
and very accomplished student, it seems
yes,
like.
yes,
Yeah,
very
she
focused.
liked to, I guess, her studies and was a very social person.
Yes, and you could tell her parents, especially her mother, got her involved with these activities early on.
And her activity continued on as she was a student at Transylvania.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Now, Betty Gail entered Transylvania. Like I said, she got a 4-year scholarship, which is quite an achievement in itself.
Especially.
She entered the school in the fall of 1960, and she immersed herself in the normal school activities like joining a sorority. She attended all the dances. Very, very active in the social activities of the school, including the sorority. She was a member of the school choir and also a member of the pep club. And like I said, she attended all the school dances. She was very personable and very popular, in addition to being very studious and focused.
And not what you would think that somebody would hate enough to kill. What was the activity like in her life in the week leading up to the crime?
Well, in October 1961, which is when she was murdered, she had a very interesting and turbulent week. Just days before her murder, on October 18, 1961, Betty Gail Brown again appeared on the front page of the newspaper. She was very photogenic. I guess the reporters just found her wherever she was, because she ended up in the newspaper quite a bit. Anyway, her picture showed up on the front page of the newspaper 8 days before her murder, preparing for upcoming Sadie Hawkins activities that weekend at Transylvania. Her picture was with a couple other students, and Betty Gail was clad in a kind of a little Abner Daisy May outfit. That's the best way I can describe it. The photograph actually was taken only a few yards away from where she was found dead the following week. Coincidence maybe, but after the murder, this photo would soon ramp up the list of possible motives and suspects. After she was murdered, it brings into the question, well, did somebody see this photograph and started stalking her as a result?
Maybe.
Pretty coincidental that the photo ended up in the newspaper only a week before she was found murdered. And as I mentioned, the week leading up to her murder was very turbulent for Betty Gail. Something was bothering her. Not sure what, but her classmates could probably, if they were still around, could tell you more. She reportedly fainted during a sorority meeting a few nights before the crime. A classmate, after the crime had occurred, claimed that only a couple nights before the murder, she had had a dream about Betty Gail and something bad happened to her. She died in this dream of her classmates. Other classmates were very concerned about her well-being since she seemed to be under the weather. Her parents even claimed she had been receiving threatening phone calls after her photograph had appeared on the front page of the newspaper the week before. So something was really troubling her for sure, and directly or indirectly may have culminated in the crime that took place.
So talk to us a little bit about the day of the crime.
Well, Thursday, October 26, 1961 began as a normal day for Betty Gail. She had breakfast with her parents, and then it was off to campus for a day of classes and studies. The Browns lived on the south side of town on Lackawanna Drive off Nicholsville Road, and Betty Gail Brown lived at home and commuted to school. Most of the Transy students lived in dorms. Betty Gail lived at home. Like most of her classmates, she was looking forward to the upcoming weekend of activities at school. It was Raffin-esque weekend, and that meant a lot of activities, including a big dance. Halloween was just a few nights away, and excitement was all over campus in preparation for these big events. But Betty Gail, being the studious person that she was, had a very difficult biology test to prepare for the next day on Friday. She was disciplined and focused on this aspect of college life. I mean, she had her fun with dances and so forth. So anyway, after a day of classes, Betty Gail returned to her home and had dinner with her parents. According to her parents, Betty Gail had suggested to them about a good movie that they may be interested in watching in town. So around 7 p.m., the parents went out to see this in-town movie. Betty Gail Brown had told them that she would be returning to campus for an all-evening study session with 3 of her classmates for that all-important biology test the next morning. She had told them she would be home around 10:30 or 11 p.m. She left for campus shortly after her parents had left for the movie and arrived at Fourier Hall, which is a girls' dorm on North Broadway on Transy's campus. She arrived there approximately 7:15, 7:30. After an evening of study with her classmates, Betty Gail bid her classmates and the dorm mom good night, and they watched her cross the street to her car parked directly across the street in a semicircular drive right across from the dorm. And this was about 11:50 p.m. Since it was so late, her classmates asked her if she wanted to spend the night at the dorm since the test was at 8:30 the next morning. She declined, saying she wanted to wash and roll her hair before going to sleep. A fellow student who had just returned a date to the dorm saw Betty Gail in her car and pulled his auto next to her, and they chatted for a few minutes. After talking, according to this student, they both left the parking lot headed to their respective destinations. Both cars headed out of the lot, taking a right on North Broadway and a right on 4th Street and then another right on North Upper. And as the student pulled his car into the men's dorm's parking lot, he saw Betty Gail's auto heading south towards 3rd Street. This was the last known person to see Betty Gail Brown alive.
What happens when she doesn't show up at the house?
Well, that's when we get to what I call the search. She told her parents she'd be home by 10:30, 11 o'clock. So when Betty Gail had not returned home by 12:30, her mother started to become worried. They had returned from the movie around 10 p.m. and the father, with a headache, went to bed while Quincy Brown, that's the mother's name, waited up for her daughter. According to her account, when Betty Gail had not returned home by 12:30, she began the first of 3 searches for her daughter. Without waking up her husband, she left the house and drove down Nicholsville Road, down Limestone towards the Transy campus, using the same route Betty Gail normally used in hopes that she would see her as she was heading home. She looked on side streets and drove past Old Morrison on 3rd Street, but did not go up the circular driveway. She drove up to the Fourier Hall dorm, and without seeing anything, then drove back using the same route. She was expecting to see Betty Gail's car in the garage when she reached home and was alarmed when she did not see her car. So she immediately went out for another search. This time going down Rosemont to Clay's Mill, down Broadway, and to the dorm again, not seeing anything. And she returned home. After the second search, this is about 1:45 a.m., she had decided to wake up her husband. She did. They called the hospitals and police to see if any accidents had occurred involving her 1959 Simca foreign-made car, but they did not mention her by name. They didn't want to embarrass her if she had gone somewhere. Anyway, the father decided to go out for a short search of his own, and he went to a couple places, a restaurant and a men's dorm over at UK, to see if she had gone over there. Then, finding nothing, he returned home and called the police to report his daughter was missing. And this was about 2:51 a.m. on the morning of October 27th. At this point, and all units call went out to the police to search for the missing Betty Gail Brown. About the same time, Quincy Brown went out on a third trip in search of her daughter, using the same route she had used during the first search. She arrived on campus and parked in the parking lot across the street from the dorm. Now, this was the very same spot Betty Gail had parked in earlier when she was studying at the Fourier Hall. When she arrived there, she saw the dorm house mother and some co-eds standing at the entrance door of the dorm, and some of them were crying. So at that point, I think she knew something was really wrong. So she walked over there, and sensing something was wrong, she immediately crossed back over after talking to them briefly and met a policeman driving through. She asked the officer if Betty Gail Brown had been located yet, and the officer, with grief written on his face, said, "We have found your daughter." After the dad called the police at 2:51 a.m., and the bulletin went out to the police department, shortly after 3 a.m., a police officer, Donald Duckworth, pulled up the semicircular driveway of Old Morrison and approached a frost-covered automobile parked just to the east of the illuminated lights of Old Morrison. And inside the car with her head tilted back and sitting in the driver's seat with a bra draped over her shoulder and neck was Betty Gail. She had been strangled. When the officer had notified Mrs. Brown that her daughter had been found, she had said, "Don't tell me anything else," and he drove her home where she told her husband what had happened. She asked no questions of the officer on the trip home, the how, why, where, who kind of thing that you normally would ask. She was probably in too much of a shock to ask questions. But anyway, Betty Gail was found. Mm-hmm. The search was over, but in a lot of ways, even today in 2018, the search is still on it.
Well, thank you, Wayne, for sharing your research with us. And it's a fascinating story, and I think that's why people are still talking about it. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Join us next time as we discuss the murder of Betty Gail Brown. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Miriam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane. Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Miriam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. This episode discusses an unsolved murder involving some disturbing details and may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. Good day, everybody. We're going to continue with the story of the murder of Betty Gail Brown with Wayne Johnson. This is part 2 of our podcast. Wayne, we had stopped last time when they found the body in front of Old Morrison. How did the investigation start?
Well, the murder of Betty Gail Brown was, of course, headline news, not only here in Lexington, but in newspapers all over Kentucky. I mean, this was a big story, big mystery. Mm-hmm. Police here in Lexington dedicated all their available resources and staff to try to solve the murder. They did the best they could, but they had never encountered such a baffling case before. Now, Lexington's had its share of famous crimes over the years. The Betty Shea murder of the late 1800s, mm-hmm. the 1920 Geneva Hardman murder, which resulted in the courthouse riots in 1920. Of course, the 1941 Marion Miley murder was huge. 1965 Mary Gawain murder, and the 1977 Melanie Flynn disappearance. Yeah. All these crimes are noted in Lexington history, are fascinating crimes, but I don't think anything has reached the legendary status of the Betty Gail Brown mm-hmm. case. I mean, here it is 57 years later, and people writing books about it, and here we are talking about it. So it was a big deal back then, and still a big deal. People want to see this thing solved.
And it's so tragic, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes. It's
the details of the murder. And
it's tragic for her and tragic for her parents and her friends and the school and so forth. Mm-hmm. You know, a reporter said years later, after Betty Gail was killed, he noted in this article, he said Betty Gail Brown was more famous and known because of her murder than she ever was in real life. And when I read that, I said to myself, well, maybe so, but I think, just researching this person's biography over the years, I think if she had lived, she would have done something special. I'm not quite sure what it would have been, but she was.
She was a very ambitious and very determined young woman with everything she did.
She had some talent.
Yeah.
And I think it would have led to.
So, what are some of the rumors about, since the murder was never solved?
Well, the motive was unclear,
mm-hmm.
and I think the key to solving this case, and would imagine the police would say so too, is let's find the motive, and maybe by finding the motive, you can solve the case. The motive was unclear. They ruled out robbery because her purse was intact. She had jewelry on. None of that was taken. Sexual assault, even though a bra was used as a murder weapon, was ruled out because she hadn't been raped. So they ruled that out. The physical evidence was very limited, and reliable witnesses just weren't there. There were none. A waitress at a local drive-in had grabbed the front page news headline a few days later when she claimed she had served Betty Gail and another girl at her restaurant at about midnight the evening of the crime. But it turns out she may have been mistaken on that day, on the day that she served Betty Gail and her friend. And this led to all kinds of rumors that even persist to the current day. Many of Betty Gail's classmates told police they thought they knew who committed the crime. And a man even went to the police station and told the police who he suspected had committed the crime.
But nothing came of it, or?
Well, I'm sure that it was investigated, but as we see 57 years later, nobody was, it doesn't look like any of them got caught or were put on trial. A transit worker quit his job the day after the murder and left town immediately, so he was put out there as a suspect. A radio station even aired a report a couple days after the murder that a girl had been arrested, and then had to back off the report when no arrest was made. The local newspaper even at the time reported they were ready to announce who killed Betty Gail, and then they backed out of the story moments or minutes before the newspaper went to press and backed down from it. So there was a lot of speculation at the time, a lot of rumors. And, you know, the police not only had to deal with all these rumors and theories, but they also had to contend with this media frenzy which fed all these rumors. You know, the newspapers were reporting
False information.
well, yeah, you know, you can say fake news may not have been invented in the fall of '61 in Lexington, Kentucky, but it sure seemed to be perfected. There was a lot of false information out there. They had to contend with that during their investigation. They had to contend with the Transylvania president, who seemed to be conducting his own investigation on campus. He would call male students into his office and conduct interviews, trying to find out what happened. And then Betty Gail's mother, Quincy Brown, conducted her own investigation. She went out and interviewed the waitress that said she had seen Betty Gail. And so the police were dealing with all this, and it really made things difficult for them. And, you know, the Transy students were caught in this as well. You know, fingerprinting of all the male Transy students took place, and a lot of them had to go through lie detector tests to be cleared. And even after all this, there still wasn't a solution to the crime.
And the fingerprints that were found in the car were
they found the ones that you would normally expect to find. Betty Gail's, and even though they didn't fingerprint Betty Gail before she was buried, but I'm sure her fingerprints are in there. They found her mother's fingerprints, they found the father's fingerprints, and they found the only other identifiable fingerprint that was found was the car mechanic that had worked on her car that morning. And his fingerprints were found there, but there's very little physical evidence in the car as to who committed this crime. So after weeks of headlines and the investigations, the story kind of went into the background, and occasionally over the next couple years a possible lead would be reported, and the news would report it, but they always led to nothing. So Betty Gail faded away to the back of people's minds, but it always remained with the community.
After a few years of the crime remaining unsolved, somebody confessed to the murder.
Yes. In January 1965, what seemed to be a break in the case happened. In Klamath Falls, Oregon, the police department there contacted the Lexington Police Department and said that they had a man in their drunk tank who wanted to confess to the crime of murdering Betty Gail Brown. His name was Alex Arnold. He was a 33-year-old former Lexingtonian, lived here in Lexington. He was a horse groom. Of course, the Lexington police flew out there and talked to Arnold and actually got a confession from Alex Arnold.
Okay.
He confessed to a crime. In the confession, he claimed he was in the area on the night of the murder and had just awoken after having a few drinks and came across a car parked in front of old Morrison and saw a couple girls in there embracing. And he went up to them and asked, I think he asked for a match for his cigarette. And according to him, they started cursing him out. So he got mad and he reached into the car and beat and strangled Betty Gail Brown with her bra, which was already off according to him. And the other girl, according to him, ran away.
Okay.
That was his confession. He said he did it. The police, of course, had to take this confession seriously.
Of course.
So this brought the whole Betty Gail Brown story back to the front page again. You know, in their anxiety to get this case solved, the police and prosecutors took Arnold at his word for his confession, and I don't blame him for that. But most everything in his confession could have been gotten from newspaper reports at the time of the murder.
Okay.
Everything that he talked about, with the exception of approaching two girls in a car in front of old Morrison, was actually reported in the newspaper. So they took his confession very seriously, although little attention was paid to the fact that Arnold was also experiencing alcohol withdrawal symptoms at the time of his confessions. Yeah, he confessed to the crime, but when he was in his cell out there in Oregon, he was also talking to dots on the wall and probably little green men too. So it kind of brings his confession into question. They brought Arnold back to Lexington, and the prosecutor's office indicted him for the murder of Betty Gail Brown. The trial, which some would consider a show trial, grabbed the attention of the community. It took place in October 1965, and this is 9 months after he confessed to the crime. And the community really got interested in the trial, and the jury was hung 7-5 for acquittal.
So I'm assuming he rescinded his confession, and that's why it went to trial.
During the trial, he recanted his confession. He said he couldn't remember whether he killed her or not. The thing that probably got him off was he couldn't prove his own confession. You know, his confession got him to trial, but you know, he confessed, but there was no physical evidence linking Alex Arnold to the crime. You know, if you just woke up from a 3-hour drunk and went into a car to kill somebody, you would think there'd be fingerprints and all kinds of evidence that you'd leave behind. There was nothing at the crime scene to connect Alex Arnold to the crime. No fingerprints, no wine bottles that he claimed he was drinking. So it's my opinion that his confession was bogus.
Okay.
Who knows? But my instincts tell me that it was a bogus confession. Now, an interesting side note during one of my research days was during the Alex Arnold trial, one of the jurors actually received a call from a caller, a woman, who asked if the juror could take a closer look at the student who last saw Betty Gail Brown alive. She was referring to the student that walked her to her car and then followed her out. And of course, he didn't have anything to do with it. He passed a lie detector test. He had witnesses that said he returned to the dorm room and so forth. So he didn't have anything to do with it. But I've always thought that call is interesting, because it's almost like somebody out there, and back in those days, you have to remember, jurors on trials, even as prominent as the Alex Arnold trial, their names were published in the newspaper. So you could read the newspaper and say, oh, such and such is on the trial. So and then you open up the telephone book and
look up their number.
And that's what this lady did. And I always wondered if the person who called this juror and trying to divert his attention away from Alex Arnold's guilt was somehow connected to the case and knew that Alex Arnold hadn't committed the crime and was trying to save him. Because this was a death penalty case. If Alex Arnold had been proven guilty, he would have been sent to the chair.
Yeah, and the jury was not sequestered during
apparently not, because he was home during the trial and received a phone call. He immediately handed the phone to his wife and said, "This person's trying to talk to me about the case. I can't talk to him." So, But anyway, I've always wondered, is the person that called that juror somehow knows who killed Betty Gail Brown? Just the interesting side.
It is interesting.
Like I said, the jury hung 7-5 for acquittal, and the prosecution office held the indictment open over Alex Arnold in hopes of retrying the case later on. But finally, in February of 1973, all the charges were dropped against Arnold. And he died in June of 1980 at the age of 49.
Okay.
And like I said, I'm not afraid to go on record. I don't think he had anything to do with it.
Yeah. Well, that still remains a mystery, and that's why people are still talking about this murder. So it's 2018 and the murder still has not been solved. Do you think it will ever be solved?
Well, according to I think it's the Uniform Crime Report, the case is resolved. The fact that a person confessed to it and had a trial and the jury hung, officially, I guess the police reports consider this case resolved due to that. But the community, we know better. The community doesn't think this case is solved.
In fact, I was reading that in 2010, the Lexington police actually investigated a possible link to another serial killer, Nolan Ray George.
Yes.
And that he may have committed the murder. What came of that investigation?
They couldn't pin anything on him. And because there was so little evidence at the crime scene, you couldn't prove it was him. I think I read something about that where he was in the area during the time, but I don't know what they define as in the area, because he was somebody who murdered people, women, I think, up in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky. But I think it may be just grasping for straws. There's so many people, and especially the police department, who want to get this thing resolved. And it's like trying to solve the Rubik's Cube. I think there's 43 quintillion ways of doing the Rubik's Cube, and it's almost that way with this murder case. It's like there's so many things. I do think that, instead of concentrating on who killed Betty Gail Brown, that if you're starting to look at this case today, you might be better off trying to look at the motive first, why she was murdered. Because to me, that's the key question, other than who murdered her, is why she was murdered. I think if you can answer that question, you can possibly answer the who portion of it. Will it ever be resolved? I think Betty Gail Brown, she would be, 76 years old now? I think she still has, like I said, she was a very popular person. I think she still has a lot of friends around that maybe might have some pertinent information to solve the case, but are, for whatever reason, afraid to come out and say what they know. Maybe they don't want to damage somebody's reputation, or maybe they're just not quite sure. But maybe one of them will have a, quote, rosebud moment near the end and come out and say, well, this is the person that did it. Her father died in 1990, and her mom died, I think, in 2002. So both parents are gone.
She didn't have any siblings?
She was an only child, but she does still have friends around. And occasionally, when you're reading the newspaper reports, you'll see a friend quoted about, still searching and still hoping to find what happened. So I think there's still some people out there who may come forward at some point and just decide, hey, before I leave this earth, I want to clear this up. And I actually think that's the only, other than 100% provable confession from somebody, deathbed confession, I don't think this thing will ever be solved completely.
Okay, so you said that there's a lot of rumors going around at the time of the investigation. What are some of your theories and some of the rumors that you came upon during your research?
Okay. Well, whenever a child dies in mysterious circumstances like this, of course, the parents are the first people. Well, they're the first people that you want to clear and get them out of the way so you can concentrate on some other suspects. The thing that's always bothered me about this case, and I grew up watching Columbo, the famous TV detective, and he always caught his person by something that he would just see, and he just says to himself, this doesn't fit in the scenario. Well, the one thing to me that doesn't fit on the day of the crime, and it just could be me, but it doesn't fit to me that two working parents go out to see a movie on a Thursday night, which is work the following day they have to work.
Yeah.
Maybe they weren't working the next day, but Betty Gail had suggested that they go see this movie when they were eating dinner on the night of the crime, and they went to see the movie.
Okay.
So I would be really interested, if I was investigating this case, I think first of all, logic tells me when Betty Gail Brown left Foyer Hall at midnight after a long day of study, classes and school and all that, and she had a major test the next morning at 8:30, and she jumps in her car and she's heading home. She is seen heading home. Logic, nothing else but logic tells me she was heading home.
Yeah.
I know all these rumors were that, well, she was seen at this restaurant or she was seen with her boyfriend, all this stuff. Logic would tell you that she made it home or she was heading home. So either she got home or she was stopped on the way home by somebody she knew.
Yeah.
That's what logic tells me. So, yeah, if I was investigating this case, I would kind of start with the parents to see if I can clear them. Now, in their defense, they did pass a lie detector test.
Yeah.
About 3 weeks later, they requested a lie detector test because rumors are all over.
Rampant
And actually, an anonymous caller had called their home and accused Mrs. Brown of committing a murder. So they called the police and said, hey, this is what's going on. So, they were the subject of suspicions at the time. And like I said, I would be interested to see what movie they went to.
And what time they came home?
Yeah, they claim they got home about 10 o'clock.
Okay.
So, but it would be interesting to me, from my perspective, from the psychological motive part of this crime, I would be really interested to know what movie they saw.
Yeah.
And then take it from there.
Interesting.
And hopefully clear them.
Did the mother say why she waited so long to wake up the dad? She went on 2 searches.
Well, her searches were problematic for her as far as these rumors, because she did a lot of things, or didn't do a lot of things during her searches that people looked at and kind of wondered. Like, for an example, at 12:30 when she jumped in her car, she didn't wake up her husband. And, that's another kind of problem too, is that after the crime they had reported to the police that Betty Gail had been receiving threatening phone calls after her photo appeared in the newspaper.
Okay.
Well, if I'm a parent, I'm not so sure I'd let my 19-year-old daughter out driving around after midnight if she'd been receiving threatening phone calls. Well, anyway, Mrs. Brown, instead of calling the dorm to find out if Betty Gail was still there, jumped in her car and started looking for her.
Without calling first.
Without calling first. And then when she got to the dorm, she didn't bother to knock on the door and find out whether she was still there or not. Maybe she thought, since she didn't see the car, that she wasn't there. But, she didn't wake up the dad. Another major problem is she didn't pull up to Old Morrison.
Yeah.
She claims she went up and down the streets, looking on side streets, looking in parking lots, and she looked everywhere, apparently, but the place that her daughter's car was found, which was in front of Old Morrison.
And that's a big drive. I mean, you can't really miss it.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And, speaking, you guys are parents, and you probably know this. If something happened to your child, all reason goes out the door. You may not think reasonably about what you should do. So, I got to think that maybe that's what was going on with Quincy Brown. But that her search and the reporting of her search really brought her into the forefront of suspicions with the community.
And the rumors, of course. Yeah.
Yes, and then Betty Gail's classmates, Some of them apparently pointed toward her, too. It actually got so bad for Mrs. Brown that her Home Crafters Club actually felt the need to write an editorial letter to the Herald Leader saying, taking up for her, saying, she'd never do anything like this, and she's a very loving person. So the rumors are out there. They've tried to figure this case out for 57 years, and I tell you, I've heard numerous names. I'll never mention them publicly, but I've heard names that astound me as somebody who said that, well, this person's the one that killed her. And I'm like, oh. So there's all kinds of rumors and names that are thrown out there, and everybody's willing to say their opinion about who they think did it, but nobody knows. Nobody can say, well, why?
And I think that's the reason why this story remains so fascinating for people, and that's why the rumors are so rampant.
Yeah, that's where I'd start the investigation, is concentrate on the why and concentrate on the one thing that seems most out of place to me is the movie attendance on a working night. I love going to movies, but
Not on a work night.
I can't ever remember going to a movie on a working night, unless I'm working on a Saturday and I go on a Friday night or something. But that seems out of place. So that's the first thing I would look at. And then, like I said, hopefully you can clear the parents and then go on to the next suspect. So.
Well, thank you so much, Wayne, for your talk today and your research. It's pretty extensive.
I do think at some point in the next few years, I think somebody's going to come out and we'll have a name.
Well, hopefully, I think for some closure for the community as a whole. Well, thank you, Wayne.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Miriam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.